Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
We are living in a time of change, of creativity, and one place where we see that very explicitly is in our Seder. Being a private ceremony for the most part, although we do have a second night Seder here at Temple Israel, the Seder is one that lends itself to the creativity of an individual household or group that has gotten together. If anybody's been paying attention, what sort of things have been introduced in recent years to our contemporary Seder experiences in many houses and communities? Oh dear, everyone.
The orange.
An orange, right? Very famously, well, at least in some circles now, an orange has been added into the Seder plate. This is back from an expression given to a woman that a woman rabbi, a woman has as much place being a rabbi as an orange does on the Seder plate. And as a statement of, well, then I guess we need oranges on the Seder plate because women have every right to stand in the community as full members. The orange began to get introduced, and now it has taken on a broader representation of any that have been treated as an other, outside, or second-class citizen within the Jewish world, that they too have a place front and center on the Seder plate. Any other things that have been added to some tables around the world?
Miriam's cup.
The cup of Miriam. We have a cup for Elijah. More on that tomorrow in our sermon. And then we now have many people putting a cup of Miriam on the table to try and remind us of Miriam's central role within the miracle of the Exodus as well. Now, many people, of course, object to these innovations. But think for a second, what other innovations have made their way into our Seder over the years? Gefilte fish, very good. There is no attribution that gefilte fish or matzah bowls, or even more importantly, horseradish, were ever a part of a classical Seder, not in the days of Joshua and the judges, not in the days of the rabbis, not until very recently, especially with regards to horseradish. And really, you should be using a bitter herb, not a root. But that's a whole other conversation I'll be happy to fill you in on more later. What else has changed on our Seder plate?
Vegan Seder.
There are people now that are loath to have meat, and thus the shank bone has been replaced by other vegan substitutes as a way of maintaining the zecher, the reminder, but not by actually having an animal part on that Seder plate. Now that may come as a little bit of a shock. Maybe you have a question about that, but then again, we went from having only 3 questions to having 4 questions, and all those questions almost have changed throughout the years. So even the 4 questions themselves have been under revolution, as many other elements have. But let's talk about what that vegan thing is supposed to do. What is it substituting for? The lamb, the shank bone. Well, what's the shank bone substituting for? Because I'll let you in on a little secret. Flip back through the pages of history. Go back 2,000 years. There wasn't a shank bone on the Seder plate. That's because there was a shank on the dinner plate. That is to say, the shank bone that we have on our Seder plate now was not a part of the Seder plate. It was a part of the Seder meal. That you actually had this lamb that was served at the Seder. And it was more than the main course. It was the point of everything. Everything else was quite secondary to eating from the Passover sacrifice, the Pesach itself, as it was called. And for those of you that have studied with me during our Mishnah, when we went through Pesachim, you may have been surprised that it wasn't until we reached the very end of the entire Masechet that we talked about the Seder itself, but the vast bulk of that section was dealing with the sacrifice, was dealing with the preparation of the lamb, the slaughtering of the lamb, the way the blood was handled, the way the lamb had to be cooked, the way the lamb had to be served, who participated in it, who didn't. That was some 80 to 90% of the halakha surrounding Pesach at the time. The other parts also covering, of course, the getting rid of chametz and the avoidance of chametz. We don't have any more lamb, though, do we? In fact, in some communities, it is even their custom not to eat lamb at all, specifically so that it not be mistaken for the sacrifice. Does that mean our seders are incomplete? Does that mean our seders are broken?
Things evolve.
Things evolve. Now, this is one of the more difficult concepts for us to wrap our head around. Yes, things evolve. But can Judaism, as we are here now in the Parshiot of Vayikra, of Leviticus, can Judaism survive without sacrifices? This may seem like a silly question in the 21st century, but in the 1st century, with the destruction of the Second Temple, and certainly in the 6th century BCE with the destruction of the First Temple, these were among the most important questions that could be asked. How, when we no longer have an altar, can Judaism survive? Well, to understand that, we have to ask, why did we have an altar in the first place? We can't understand what role or how Judaism can function without the altar if we don't know what role that altar was filling in the first place. So, why have sacrifices? Why did God command in this book of Leviticus and other parts of the Torah, and most notably for the season, the holiday of Pesach, why did God command these sacrifices to us?
Well, I was sort of thinking, they were for unintentional sins, and sort of the unintentional things we maybe minimize in our life. Oh, it was an accident, I didn't realize I did that. But when you have a sacrifice, it becomes very salient. Wow, there's a real consequence to my actions.
So with some of the sacrifices, like you're saying, for things that were what's called bishgaga, that were that were by accident, and then when we become aware of them, we wish to make an offering in that. That certainly was true, but those were not the only sacrifices that we offered. Certainly the Passover sacrifice was not by accident. It was very much to fulfill a command. And there were other sacrifices when one committed a sin on purpose. And there were sacrifices for other holidays. And there were sacrifices when you just were feeling good, of well-being. And then there were the sacrifices on behalf of the community that were a daily part of our service and had no relationship to an individual at all. There were, as you're reading through the book of Vayikra, a lot of sacrifices. Why? Not why each individual sacrifices, but why a sacrifice at all?
Does it have anything to do with showing our commitment to God and repentance for breaking His words?
Well, again, let's set aside repentance, because not all sacrifices were about repentance. And indeed, unless a person was messing up a lot, hopefully throughout the annual cycle of an individual's life, they would be, if blessed, able to offer more sacrifices of goodwill rather than sacrifices of error, of a chatat offering, a sin offering.
That's why I was wondering, the first thing was commitment, though.
And indeed, this is the Passover sacrifice is the first sacrifice that we see given as a communal type act back in the book of Shemot.
Some of the sacrifices were also to nourish the community and help those that were in need.
Indeed, the sacrifice, and the Passover as being a perfect example of that, were meant to bring people together. The lamb was often too much for one family to eat, and so you would naturally pool the resources of multiple households to share that offering. This is why we still invite guests for our starim to be able to share. And it had this bridge for the community, and especially for those that were less fortunate and would otherwise be unable to celebrate a holiday in gladness. Now, this still doesn't quite scratch the itch, though, because there are so many other ways to do those things. Indeed, can we still bring people together in the modern world without sacrifices? We do. I hope we do. We're still here 2,000 years later without sacrifices. Something is holding us together. Can we still help those that are less fortunate without the commandment to share part of a festival sacrifice with them? Absolutely, and certainly the laws of tzedakah extend far beyond those occasions, and we still pursue those, hopefully passionately. So why did God give us sacrifices to begin? Because yes, it does seem for the last 2,000 years-ish that we've been able to fulfill all of the the spirit of a sacrifice, whether it be teshuvah, repentance, and finding a way to repair a breach in our relationship with God, to show the significance of our errors, even those made by mistake, or whether it is that we want to stay linked to a community or help those that are less fortunate, we have found beautiful ways to emulate all of those activities, which means we have to go back to that original question: why not start with what we do now, rather than introduce sacrifices which are only going to be eventually obliterated as the temples fall?
Because maybe that was the culture that they lived in, and the awareness of their relationship with God at that time, it spoke to them doing sacrifices, just like for now in our awareness, sacrifices don't make any sense.
Very good. As Rambam says, and everybody knows I love Maimonides, he argues quite convincingly that the people of the generation of the Exodus, and for hundreds of years later, that was all they could understand as being a primary mode of serving their God. That the idolatry and the culture of sacrifice was so pervasive that even as God tried to pull us away from idolatry, he could not pull us away from the mechanics of serving a God through the offerings at an altar. This is something that, as we saw, was already intrinsic to Abraham, even as he began his relationship with God, and was something that, as a nation, we had to eventually be weaned off of, to eventually recognize that we didn't need to slit the throat of an animal, we didn't need to offer up grain, we didn't need to offer up wine, oil, and all the other things, but instead we needed to pursue the spirit that each of these sacrifices was meant to embody. The details of the sacrifice make sure that we don't forget what they are intended to inspire within us, which is why we still read from the book of Vayikra and still study it. But we have to also recognize that if we don't feel a deep, passionate longing for the restoration of the fires of the altar, that's okay. It is not necessarily that God wanted us to always be offering sacrifices. Yes, I know that some others around the world think that blood is always needed for a relationship with God. But rather, in Judaism, it was perhaps needed for some generations in order to show them something familiar. The same way that if I were to tell you that from now on, I have realized that our people have reached a point where we no longer need music to connect to God. We no longer need to sing. We no longer need to chant. We can just read the text without the emotional crutch of notes and rhythm. Most of you would probably consider me a little wrong. Like, what kind of worship service would it be if we didn't have some chanting, some music? It wouldn't feel right. Well, that is part of our modern culture, and indeed part of human culture for a very long time. And no, I'm not advocating that we strip away all music, but pointing out that sometimes we will mistake the mode of worship for the purpose of worship. And certainly the mode of sacrifices was an important and passionate part of our ancestors' worship, but we must find ways to be passionate without it. So when you lay up your Seder and you look at that plate, and whether you have an orange or not, whether you have a cup of Miriam or not, or whether you have the more classic settings upon the table, recognize that yes, the sacrifice is not there, but that doesn't mean that we are missing out. That the Seder and its message has endured without the lamb on the table, because it was always there just as a symbol. It was never the point of what we were doing. Shabbat Shalom. Of course, we still remember the sacrifices in the cycle of our day, as we have democratized their scheduling and include them as part of when we do our different services, whether it be Shacharit, Mincha, or Mariv, which we now turn to page 39a to continue. The evening service as the evening wrap-up at the altar of Jerusalem.